all for being here today. We are quite happy to see you here on this lovely day, and I'm thrilled to be sitting on this stage with my dissertation advisor, Dr. Medford, and someone I've become very familiar with lately, Dr. LaRoche. So we're going to just get started here. So the first question I want to throw out here to both of you lovely ladies is, what does freedom look like?
You know, there's a ad that often says, pretends to be free. When somebody is escaping from slavery, one of the things that people talk about is that they assume the pretensions of freedom, that they actually look different, they walk different, they talk different, they dress differently. So freedom has a very physical component to it. And so that when you see someone and they have taken on the pretensions of freedom, they are looking you in the face, and you know throughout history that this eye-to-eye contact is something that blacks are not supposed to be doing. They dress in a particular way. So that on the physical level is what freedom looks like. But many of the people that I study who escape from slavery are freedom-minded long before they leave. And so freedom has, I think, different manifestations depending on where you are and what you're looking at. But you know, that for me is the physical answer, and I'll turn it over to Edna, and I'm sure I'll have more to say after she has as she answers.
Yeah, I think we need to remember that freedom looks different for different groups of people. If we look at how African Americans in the North who are already quote unquote free view freedom, it is that they want more rights. They want full citizenship rights, and it's something they don't have. So if you're living in New York, if you're living in Pennsylvania, you're not free in the same way that a white man or woman is free. You don't have equal access to the vote. In New York, there's a residency requirement, and there's a requirement in terms of $250 worth of property. And that sounds like peanuts to us, but that's a lot of money in those days. And so most people don't have that. If you're in Pennsylvania, you have no voting rights, period. But that's the North. That's free country, but those rights are not there. Freedom to those people then means access, equal access. It means equality. For someone who is enslaved, freedom means being able to get up, go out to another plantation, to another state, go to work when you want to, get up when you want to, be able to protect your family, make sure that your children are not sold away, that your wife does not have to work in the fields. So it's a very different connotation there. And of course, freedom to white Southerners in many regards means plunder, rape, murder. It's everything negative. It's black people not being held down by slavery. So it depends upon who you ask what freedom is all about.
And I do think the freedom to own yourself, self-possession, is something that we don't usually think about, but that is part of what freedom suggests. I think when you look in the law, there's so many laws that are there regulating black freedom, but we don't think of those laws in that way. But I think that when we begin to kind of pick it apart in the ways that Dr. Medford is referring to, and start to think about different constituencies, freedom is going to be very different for a white woman, for example, from a black woman. Freedom to own your children, which is probably one of the greatest denials in all of slavery. Not just to protect your family, but to really possess your children in a way that you can control and in a way that you have influence. This is one of the basic rights that's taken away in slavery. So there, you know, I think that this question we'll weave through, because we'll come back to it, because I think it's a foundation of everything that we're talking about.
Thank you. So if we look at emancipation specifically, how are black people in Washington, D.C. responding to D.C. compensated emancipation? And then can we look more broadly at how African Americans, free and enslaved, are responding to Lincoln's proclamation, the Emancipation Proclamation?
Of course, D.C. emancipation occurs in April of 1862, and the Emancipation Proclamation doesn't occur until January 1st, 1863. And there's such a small number, relatively, of enslaved people in Washington. There are about 3,100. There are more than 10,000 African Americans who are resident in the city. The majority of them are free. But when the war occurs, you have a lot of refugees from slavery coming into the district, and the population swells to 40,000. 40,000. So it's incredible the number of people who are already here. And of course, when DC emancipation goes into effect, more and more people are coming in. It's very difficult sometimes to distinguish between those who were here before this and then those that come later. But the people who were here and are freed legally by DC emancipation have had certain advantages that the folk coming in didn't have. The people who are coming in primarily are coming from the farms and plantations. The people who are here already are, for the most part, domestic laborers and have certain kinds of advantages as a consequence of that, have made certain connections with some prominent people sometimes who can perhaps help them find a job. But there are also those folk who are beyond the age where they are very helpful. And those folk really have a very hard time. We should remember that the DC Emancipation Bill is passed by Congress on April 11th, 1862. It's signed by Lincoln on April 16th. And so it sits on his desk for a couple of days. I think he doesn't really get it until around the 14th or so. But it sits on his desk for a couple of days, and people are really worried about whether or not he's going to sign that bill into law. And one of his good friends actually puts in his diary, so this is a contemporary source, this is primary source. He says that Lincoln actually delayed because a good friend of his, the former governor of Kentucky, came to him and requested that he wait a while until he had the opportunity to get 2 of his slaves out of the city, because he didn't want them freed. Yeah, so he felt that they were too old to really take care of themselves. So he never considered the possibility that perhaps after a lifetime of labor, he might help them a little bit. So we will never know if that's true or not, but this is Orville Browning, a friend of Lincoln's, who says this in his diary. And I'm sure he never imagined that historians would come, years later and look at what he wrote. But this is what's happening. There are some people who are attempting to remove certain people out of the city so that they won't be freed. There are rules against this, but they're trying to do it anyway. And in terms of, African Americans who are being freed in the district are of course, are overjoyed that they're getting their freedom. But it's interesting how this works. People who get their freedom are not satisfied until other people get theirs as well. So it's not sufficient to have your freedom. They want the rest of the South freed as well. And of course, DC is a part of the South, whether we believe that or not. And so you have enslaved people hearing of emancipation in DC, and so they're coming to DC in droves. When the Emancipation Proclamation occurs, of course, they're leaving the plantations and farms and going wherever they can find freedom. But of course, they were doing this even before the proclamation was issued. Even before war was officially declared, African Americans are running away because they see this division between North and South as a possibility for them to get their freedom.
You know what I would add? We have to remember that the District of Columbia is governed by Congress. And so throughout the history of slavery, the abolitionists keep trying to get slavery abolished in Washington, D.C. specifically, because this is where federal law is controlling slavery. This isn't about states' rights. This isn't about anything other than the government condoning slavery. And so when we go off and we think about the states, we have to understand that as long as there is slavery in Washington, D.C., it is being upheld by the federal government, which is why President Lincoln has to sign this particular order. We don't usually think about how, not duplicitous, but how implicated the federal government is in slavery. And so these abolitionists keep hammering away at that one aspect, slavery in D.C., slavery in D.C., It's different than slavery anywhere else. And the fact that that Lincoln doesn't sign the Emancipation Proclamation for the District of Columbia until so late really is indicative of how much Congress and how much the federal government was in support. When we think about celebration of Emancipation Day, of course, people are thrilled. Around the country, you're seeing these kinds of celebrations. You're seeing people who are overjoyed that at last the one thing that they have been fighting for and looking for finally occurs. But there's a distinction between emancipation, which blacks are going to learn very quickly, and liberation. That emancipation means you're freed from slavery. But it's going to take the Civil Rights Amendments, it's going to take the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendment to start to bring in the rhetoric of liberty, to start to bring freedom, because the Emancipation Proclamation was a release. It did not guarantee the rights of freedom that we're thinking about. And to draw these distinctions, I think is very important. When we have been looking at the history that we've been given, and particularly black history, the nuance is not there. And so the kind of subtleties that I'm talking about, we don't often have the opportunity to think on that level. Most of the black history, that if people know it at all, it's very black and white, and I'm not using it as a pun. It's really very much one or the other, but there's a great deal of nuance. And we really have to look at liberation. We do not call Lincoln the Great Liberator. We call him the Great Emancipator. And there's a reason that we distinguish those terms and those words.
So with that last part, Dr. LaRoche, let's deal with the notion of President Abraham Lincoln as the Great Emancipator.
You know, I take a very long view of history. I'm an archaeologist. I've been watching people escape from slavery since they came to the shores in any part of the diaspora. So I've been looking at escape from slavery from that long lens. I look at the end of the American Revolution when there was a moment, you know, I'm a ballet person, and so when there was a moment of equipoise at the end of the American Revolution when slavery could have easily ended for multiple reasons. And George Washington, one of our great slaveholders, and his family had, of course, a vested interest, just as your senator, congressman from Kentucky had an interest in not bringing emancipation at that time. So we have now, starting with our great first president, all the way through to Lincoln, an inability by any president, statesman, or any means of bringing freedom and emancipation. On that level, I have to say, Lincoln succeeded in doing something that none of his predecessors could accomplish. And so from that perspective, I can concede that yes, he is the great emancipator because he had the courage, the will, the opportunity, and he was probably forced into it. He might have been backed into a corner. I can't say that this would have happened had the constellation of events not taken place. But the most important thing for me in terms of forcing Lincoln's hand, because I look at escape from slavery, I look at every law that led up to this. I look at every fugitive slave law. I look at all of the people who are fleeing slavery and putting an inordinate amount of pressure on the government, putting an inordinate amount of pressure on the South. They're putting an inordinate amount of pressure across the country. This is what colonization is all about. Get rid of these people once they're free. So the actions of people escaping from slavery force Lincoln into the role of the great emancipator. And again, when I say that there's not a lot of nuance, okay, we have Lincoln, the great emancipator. We don't get the background. We don't begin to look at all of the various forces that come to bear that are leaning on this man from every single direction, not the least of which are the people who are held in slavery themselves. The central actors in this great drama get eliminated in almost every aspect of when you're looking over the literature. Their role tends to be either not discussed at all or diminished in a great way.
You have to wonder how you can talk about emancipation and not talk about the people who benefit from it and what role they're playing
Exactly.
in their own emancipation. And they are front and center in this. Even though Lincoln takes office and in the first inaugural address, he's talking about not interfering with slavery. He says he doesn't have the inclination or the ability to interfere with slavery. And he's going to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act that made it possible for slaveholders to pursue their runaways across those regional lines. So if they get to the North where they expect to be free, these people, these slaveholders, can send someone to recapture them and bring them back home. And even though the Confederacy has been formed and the South has seceded from the Union, Lincoln is saying, I'm going to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act at a time when we generally don't think that he should have to. Okay?
Right, right.
But what happens is African Americans, whether they heard what he said or not, paid absolutely no attention. And so they kept leaving the plantations. They kept going to the Union lines. There were some Union commanders that actually returned them to their owners, owners who were in rebellion against their government. Okay, some people were killed when they were returned, but there are other commanders like Benjamin Butler that everyone loves to hate because he was a rather obnoxious person. But the one thing he did do correctly was to allow those folk who had escaped to the Union lines to come in. And so he took them in because he thought, why keep them out there helping the Confederacy? Why not bring them into the Union ranks and put them to work? And then when their families started showing up, you know, women and children and people who were too old to really help the Confederacy, he says, now is it fair to return them to their owners too? And he says, no, come on in to the Union lines. So I think that you're absolutely right. The emancipation narrative has to be a broader narrative. We have to be more inclusive. Was Lincoln the great emancipator? It really does depend upon who you're asking. The enslaved people thought of him as the great emancipator.
Very much so.
That is where the term is coming from initially. They think of him this way before he does anything, before he issues the proclamation, anything. And it's because they hear their owners talking about this man, Lincoln, who's going to free them. And they start believing that. And some of them actually set out from the plantations on that belief that if they get to the Union lines, Lincoln is going to protect them. And so throughout the war, they're thinking this. And by January 1st, 1863, they're definitely ready to roll off those plantations because the most important man in the country has told them that they are free. And they're acting on that. But even those who decide not to leave are still destroying the institution from within. They're refusing to work. They are continuing to break tools and all the other things that they used to do under slavery. They are appropriating horses and mules and anything else that will help them travel. And they are going through the countryside and wreaking havoc on the folk who are left behind on the plantations, mostly women and children because the men have left and they're off to war. But the idea that African Americans are sitting on the sidelines waiting for white men to free them is the biggest lie that has ever been told about the Civil War. These people were out there more than 180,000 strong after the Emancipation Proclamation was issued. More than 180,000 black men served in the Union Army. So they are helping to win the war. It's one of the reasons why Lincoln issues the proclamation, because he wants to be able to bring these black men into military service. And because of their actions, because of their willingness to fight, both enslaved men and free men, the war is won for the Union.
And you know, when you think about Lincoln's relationship with colonization, with, you know, what are we going to do with these free blacks? We have to remember that free blacks, whether they are self-emancipated, whether they've escaped, whether they've been manumitted, however they get there, are considered to be extremely dangerous. They are an example of how one can live one's life as a free person to people. So, you know, if you look in this room, you could have had half slave, half free. You have free people of color in the same space with people who are held in slavery. and free people of color are then demonstrating the possibilities of freedom. They're demonstrating that one can be educated, that one can be literate, that one can function in society in all of these responsible ways. And this is a big problem for slaveholders because we have this subjugated class of people. And for slaveholders, it's important to keep them in that realm. So I think that when we're thinking about emancipation, Lincoln, the fact that Lincoln is dealing with colonization as well, that he's thinking about this, says, and when you look at the fugitive slave laws, when you look at colonization, what that says to me is that the slave-holding class understands exactly what they're doing. They understand precisely the caliber of the people they're dealing with. They understand that if we do not do something to control and regulate in a very deep way people who are being released from slavery, they will rise to a certain capacity that will be detrimental to their own interests. We don't usually talk about slaveholders in this way, but they know what they're doing. Anti-literacy laws are saying the same thing. I know if I leave you to your own devices and you can read, you will then be able to ingest these ideas and act in self-emancipatory ways. So all of this, I think, is an alternative way to think about slavery, to think about freedom, and to think about the genesis of the Civil War itself.
So it sounds like both of you believe in the argument about self-emancipation. You go along those lines that these are black people who are very active in their own freedom, and we can't just look at Abraham Lincoln as a great emancipator because they're running very early.
There's no question about it. And, you know, it's not just the enslaved population, but it's also all of those other people who have served a role in giving birth to black freedom. You know, when I first saw the Lincoln movie a couple of years ago, on the one hand, I was pleased because we get so much of our history from media, but we need to have it right since most of us are going to get it from that. And what I was disappointed in the movie for was that they started the story of the 13th Amendment in the middle of the narrative. At that point when Lincoln gets involved. Lincoln was not involved just before he was reelected. There were people in the Senate and in Congress who were pushing this. There were abolitionists. There were black people like Frederick Douglass who was giving him all kinds of grief because nothing was being done about freeing enslaved people, and he wasn't doing anything about any kind of constitutional amendment. So although he was actively involved in getting that amendment passed through the House of Representatives, he didn't play that role in the Senate. And it was passed very quickly in the Senate because of abolitionists. So we need to remember that it wasn't just Lincoln acting alone. Absolutely, he's central to the process. But there are other people who are very, very active in this as well, who take a position, especially on the 13th Amendment, much earlier than Lincoln does.
And you know, okay, so we're talking about 4 million people held in slavery. And one of the things that historians do are they think about critical mass. They think about numbers and, you know, that things have to be statistically significant. And so if we're talking about a small percentage of people who are purchasing themselves, and because we have never been able to establish a baseline number for the people who escaped from slavery, that is a huge problem. We really don't understand. You see numbers as low as 10,000, you see numbers as high as 100,000. We can't really tell, and the most successful people who escape from slavery, we will never know. Those are the people that get away, were never advertised for, we never leave without a trace. We will never know what the numbers are. So we have to ask, why do we come? If I were to poll this audience, and maybe you're more knowledgeable than most, why do we come to an understanding around slavery and around freedom and around the Civil War without the kinds of things that Dr. Medford and I are speaking about? How can we get to this point And people will say, well, you know, they were such a small fraction of people that you're talking about under these circumstances, it's insignificant. Rather than saying that if one person is freedom-minded in a situation, in an institution that is determined to control your heart, your soul, your mind, your body, your being, that the totality of what slavery was intended to be versus people who are now still able to get themselves out, that's a side of the argument that we don't usually hear and think about. When we look at what people have to do to free themselves, when we look at people who are working and paying, being cheated out of their own liberty after they've paid their money, being recaptured after they've paid, people have to participate in the object of their own oppression to get themselves out of slavery. So you have to now pay the overseer, whoever's holding you in slavery, for your own freedom. There are people who pay and work to free their families, so that and I don't know if you've seen many more, there's almost no information about self-emancipation. There are one or two good articles that really deal with it, but as a topic, it's rarely discussed. There's no full-length monographs that I can think of that are specifically devoted to this. And yet, freeing oneself by self-purchase rather than by escape is an act of economic savvy. You have to have financial literacy to be able to make the money, to save the money. You have to understand your own worth. All of these things that never get discussed when we think about how people arrive at freedom. Escape from slavery is often the last place that they look, and sometimes it's the first. But I think that this whole question around self-emancipation has a quality to it that I always come back to of self-possession, which is what I spoke about before. When we think about someone who's self-possessed in this day, there's something about their countenance, there's something about their being, there's something about how they interact, there's something about how they are. To be self-possessed is a very noble thing. These people are self-possessed. But, I'll often speak like this, and people will say, you're talking about slaves? We have such a narrow, small-minded, dismissive understanding of slaves. They're undistinguished as individuals, and they're undistinguished as agents and actors who have this kind of independent-mindedness that they can move about in their world in particular ways.
So if I may add, I think we need to clarify how they're earning money. It all depends upon where they are, what they're engaged in. If they're in the rice growing area, South Carolina and coastal Georgia, where they're working under the task system, then sometimes owners will give them a task. If they're finished by 10 o'clock in the morning, then they can spend the rest of the day working for someone else where they are earning money that they have to bring back to their owner. And if the owner is smart, he or she will give that enslaved person a small portion of the money that's been earned. There are some people who are skilled, who are living in urban areas, who are able to work away, hire their time, and work away from their owners. And if the person does what he or she's told, then they're able to keep part of the money. People are able to save money over the course of a lifetime, and then eventually are able to purchase themselves from out of slavery, or to purchase a family member out of slavery, if the owner consents to allow the person to do that.
If the owner consents.
Yes. But people who have the ability to negotiate, in an effort for labor peace. I mean, that's what the owner is doing. The owner is trying to buy peace, labor peace. But if the enslaved person can negotiate some kind of agreement that makes it possible for him or her to make a small amount of money, they will do it. There's Juliet Walker's book I'm thinking of. She talked about Free Frank, who was her great-great-grandfather, several generations removed, who founded a town in Illinois called New Philadelphia. But he had been owned by a Kentucky slaveholder who allowed him to work in Illinois in his saltpeter manufactory. And because the man did that successfully, he was given a certain amount of money. And over the course of years, he was able to earn enough money to purchase his wife's freedom. He didn't purchase his freedom. He purchased his wife's freedom because she was pregnant with their fourth child. And he didn't want another one of his children born into slavery.
And he would have had to pay for the child and the wife.
Yes, exactly, exactly. And so after they were free, then he started working all over again to free himself. And he was able to do that. And once he was freed, he purchased, I think, 14 relatives out of slavery or something over the course of his lifetime. But this is unusual. This is because of opportunities he had. He was also the son of his owner as well, which I'm sure made a difference, at least for him. But people do whatever they can get away with. If they can earn some money, they do it. If they have the opportunity to run away, they do it. It's whatever opportunities are presented.
And you know, in Lincoln's own household, Elizabeth Keckley,
Right.
she earns the money for her freedom. So you have, even Lincoln is looking at someone who is working with his wife that has come through this process.
Right,
So,
exactly.
and in the case of Free Frank, please understand that every time he had to purchase a person, he had to make a financial decision. Do I free my son first so he can earn more money? Or do I free my daughter first before she has more children and I have to pay for her and for the children? So that these kinds of questions, these kinds of decisions, these kinds of understandings have to really be factored in, because Frank is doing this repeatedly. He brings his son out first because the son has more earning capacity. But then what happens, his daughters go on to have more children. And I once had one, this was probably the touchiest question I've ever been asked. It was by an 8th grader. And the 8th grader looked at me and says, well, why would she just have more children? Why didn't she just not, not understanding the kinds of sort of sexual oppression that women are under, he was assuming there was freedom of choice. And then, I'm sitting there with this 8th grader thinking, this is going to be a tricky answer. And it was. But you'd see these kinds of questions, we don't move beyond the surface to go in and ask them. And when we move beyond the surface to go in and ask these questions, they often stir up some painful realizations that we don't necessarily want to face about slavery. And so it's easier to remain on the surface, and I understand why we have the history that we have. Because you have largely white men really not being able, not being willing to look underneath the surface of what they're seeing to talk about the realities that are actually in play.
So if we look at the long history of freedom, thinking about your work with the Underground Railroad, thinking about emancipation, how can we fit the free black community into our ideas about how are they assisting, especially during the war? You talk about Elizabeth Keckley, how are they organizing? And are there any tensions? As you talked about it earlier, Dr. Mefford, you have lots of fugitives with just the clothes on their back flooding the city, and then you have a pretty established free black community that's here that's being asked to, in many ways, assist those communities. So can we start with the Underground Railroad and talk about how free blacks are collapsing to help those who are searching for freedom, and then kind of bring it to the point where we have actually black people, free black people in DC who are struggling to help fugitives as well?
It wasn't until 1999, I always say that the great sort of scholarship on the Underground Railroad is a 21st century kind of understanding. And I think it gets kicked off in 1999 when Franklin and Schwenniger write Runaway Slaves, Rebels on the Plantation. And he talks about people coming out of the South. He gives some structure to that escape, because what we've had all along with the Underground Railroad is this kind of, we have some, centuries old scholarship. Franklin and Schwenniger actually give you a basis for looking at how people are moving through the South and moving through the cabin quarters at plantations, and how people are feeding one another, how they are assisting each other, and how they are helping people who are escaping from slavery come out of the South. You're often going places where you know the people, so you are being aided by the mother of the, so we must understand that slavery in the South is not an anonymous institution. People know where their families are, as evidenced by what happens at the end of the Civil War when people migrate to find these people, so they know where their families are. So you have that coming out of the South. And what I really worked on in the book is looking at these border communities right along the sort of the zone of freedom when you first cross into the North, a very treacherous and dangerous space. The fugitive slave laws of this country really do not make the North a free space, even though we think about it until 1850. It actually wasn't even before 1850. And so when you look at people escaping along that zone, along these borders, you see that these black communities are being established often near white abolitionist communities, and the more I study this, the more I talk to people, it seems like it's almost always the case. So African Americans are situated in the landscape, but in a way that is, they're often hidden, they're often on this marginalized land, they're not calling a lot of attention to themselves. They have these small churches. They are the way stations when people first come out of slavery, although I'm not making a blanket statement. William Wells Brown, many people say, I never saw a black community, I never saw anybody, I made it on my own. So you have all these kinds of aspects that are taking place. Some people are finding the black community, some people are getting out on their own, some people are being aided by Quakers, some people are being aided by Presbyterians. We have, and it's regional. So what you're going to have in New York, you're not going to have in Ohio, you might not have in Indiana. You have a spectrum of experiences for people who are coming out of slavery across the country. I would say that the black communities, in writing the book, it took me 10 years to piece it together, and the only way I was able to actually prove my point was by using maps. Because we don't have the literature, we don't have the narratives, we don't have all of the things that one would hope to have in terms of establishing a strong argument. But when I use the maps of the black churches, when I use the histories of the black churches that said we were an Underground Railroad church, and what has happened over time is that because these histories, these black histories are often oral, because these narratives are often in church bulletins rather than in what I would say are the established kinds of sources for historians, diaries and letters and so forth, we have essentially called these people liars. We don't believe them. And so we came back and looked at any place where people said we participated in the Underground Railroad. I chose to believe them. Now, if they tell me they have a tunnel and a hidey hole, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about a consistent narrative within these institutions that say we were an Underground Railroad site. And these narratives, mind you, started long before the Underground Railroad became fashionable. So these church histories, when you look at them, are, from the late 1800s, from 1910, 1920, long before the Underground Railroad has been received any kind of credibility. That rhetoric has been consistent with these churches. And so I took the rhetoric of the churches, I took the small black communities that I found, I took the maps of the credible white historian Wilbur Siebert, Harvard trained, that people, will respect. I used that. And then I used other narratives of escape, overlaid all of that, 5 different maps, to then say, oh, look, these routes are parallel, that they are escaping along these same routes that we see from Wilbur Siebert. We can see the black community overlays right on top of those. So that what we are, I think, at the forefront of is a reinterpretation of history with new methods. And so the history that we've been given using the documents that have been deemed acceptable gives you a certain kind of history that's going to pretty much drop out African Americans. We're going to be gone. We were legislated against literacy, so we're not writing in the ways in which we can't be leaving this long, historic trail. There are all of these ways in which we have been shunted aside from the historical narrative, and so we have to think of new ways to reposition and reimagine that history. That's just for starters.
So what's happening with these folk coming into DC and mixing with the folk who were already here? There's a great deal of tension. There are instances where the folk who were here before the war are very much embarrassed
Yes.
by the new people
Absolutely.
who are arriving. You look at Elizabeth Keckley's book, Behind the Scenes, and she's talking about her time with Mrs. Lincoln in the White House while she's founding the Contraband Relief Association. She's doing a wonderful thing. She's looking at the people who are coming in and realizing that they're destitute and they need assistance from people in the city who are better off than they are. But she's writing about them in a way that's very derogatory. They have practices, customs that are foreign to her at this point. They may not have been foreign when she was enslaved, but certainly now that she's a woman of respectability, she has difficulty with that, as do many African Americans who were either freed by the DC Emancipation Act or had been free before this. I think we need to remember as well that although there is a tremendous amount of support in the North among blacks in the North for emancipation in the South, there is a motive beyond one that's humanitarian. People who are in the North who are already free recognize that they are not sharing in America's bounty. They're not being accorded the same rights as other Americans, and they think that's true because they are connected to a group that's seen as servile, people who are still enslaved. And they recognize that as long as you have slavery in the country and all black people are tied to that in some way, well, by race, then they're never going to be able to elevate themselves. So many of them are involved in the war, are involved in agitation for the ending of slavery because they recognize that their own status will not be elevated until all black people are free. And so you see that playing out right here in the district.
And their families are held in slavery.
Right.
So, their mothers might still be held in slavery, their brothers or sisters, their fathers, their children. So that, that it's certainly everyone has to be free. And one of the things that you see is people risking their freedom to go back and to help other people out of slavery, that they really are taking their most precious possession and putting it on the line in terms of going back into the South and so forth and helping people out. So, there are ways in which to begin to think about this, but in terms of tensions, we also see betrayal. We see blacks betraying one another. They are, these rebellions, they're being betrayed from the rebellions, they're being betrayed when they're leaving. So I don't want this to sound like a monolithic kind of action where people are all surging towards freedom. This is not what is happening.
These are human beings who are behaving in a way that's in their best
Absolutely.
interest. So.
Absolutely. There are people who are having a business of lending you money to pay for your freedom, and then you have to pay the person back. It's strictly a business venture. They're all different kinds of exhibitions, and people are exhibiting all of these kinds of human qualities. And so when someone says, oh, they were betrayed, well, yes. What's your point? So that it is not we're not trying to say that we're speaking for this noble cause. That's not what we're saying. But we're also not saying that people are duplicitous and that they are betraying, because that's not the case either. So You're lurching forward. We have black people who are colonizationists. They go to Africa.
Absolutely.
They want to leave. So you have
Well, but they call it immigration.
immigration,
Not,
yes.
Not, the immigration is not
Immigrationists,
colonization.
yes, thank you. So, exactly, different term. But you still have all of these kinds of back and forth. It's not one or the other. It's not either or. It is not a dichotomy. It's all and. It's yes and. And I think that as we begin to understand slavery from this perspective, it takes on, again, a richer tone, a richer level of understanding.
Well, I've saved the loaded question for last. How would you respond to those who argue that the war was about states' rights?
May I tackle that first?
Absolutely.
Yes, yes. I've looked at the ordinances of secession, and one after another, they talk about the centrality of slavery. They talk about states' rights, but it's all couched in the whole idea of protection of slavery. There is no way to ignore it. Mississippi is the clearest on it. It says the central part of our system is slavery. I mean, they make it very clear. We need to protect slavery. If we can't protect slavery, then why are we even in existence? South Carolina isn't quite that clear in its original ordinance, but a few days later, they do a little supplemental where it is clear that it is about slavery. They talk about Lincoln and the Republican Party and how this party is anti-slavery and they're going to destroy our domestic institution. Domestic institution translates to slavery, okay? There is no way in the world that anybody who looks at those documents that are generated between December 1860 and into 1861 can deny that the South seceded over the issue of the protection of slavery. No way. You can call it states' rights, but it's about slavery and the ability of one group of men to hold another group of men and women against their will and exploit their labor. It's about that. And it's not even just about economic stuff. It's also about social issues. There's the fear that after all of this time, if you free these people, what are they going to do? You know, are they going to retaliate for centuries of injustice and inhumanity? So it's about all of that.
But how can we then, we talk about this, I look at the Confederate Constitution, and it's pretty much line for line with the U.S. Constitution, and where it deviates the greatest is around the discussion for slavery. That we will have rights to own, and they say Negroes. They do something the U.S. Constitution doesn't dare do. They never talk about it. They encode in the U.S. Constitution. They spell it out in the Constitution for the Confederate States. And yet, we are handed a history, and you know, most of you in this room are old enough that states' rights is a rhetoric that you were taught. How can you take the documents that we've just described that are so clearly about slavery and come away and give a history to a nation that talks about states' rights? You know, I am going to say something very unprofessional. It's the okie doke, okay? How can you do that? I just am consistently amazed at this argument around states' rights. I had a student, I teach at the University of Maryland in College Park. I had a student tell me, he was shocked when he came into my class, and he said, and he's maybe in his early 30s, he said they were taught it was about taxation, it was about economics, and that it was not about slavery. And this is a young man, and I poll my students every year. I want to tell you that this is not as distant as you think. That the states' rights argument is still being upheld in school systems, and it is still being taught. You have to ask yourself why. What good does that do? It exonerates the country. You know, we even call it the Civil War. It was called the Slaveholders' Rebellion. We've taken that out. We don't even accuse the slaveholders. we let them off the hook. You know, I just got a manuscript where they're still calling them masters, you know. So we have a long way to go in this country in thinking about how do we look at this. And the thing, what I teach is African American visual and material culture. And the way I get at that question is I look at Confederate money. Have you ever looked at Confederate money? You know what's on it? African Americans, cotton, hauling, working, probably the money from, I know South Carolina, I know Mississippi, I'd have to kind of go back and give you the states. You Google Confederate money and look. They are saying the economic power of the South is dependent upon the backs of the people we hold in slavery. And we're going to let you know this because we're going to put our currency on our currency. So that if you want to say it's states' rights, I will agree. It's the state's right to own slaves. They just didn't end the sentence properly. So for me, what I would rather you take away is asking yourself why this rhetoric ever came to be in the first place, and why it continues to be a narrative that we still see being perpetuated. It's something that should give us pause, and it's something that should make us understand that this country is so disconnected and uncomfortable with its own acts around slavery and therefore around race, that we do everything that we possibly can to not talk about it. So when you look in the Constitution, and the Constitution is regulating slavery and escape from slavery, they call it persons held to service. Now, if you don't know that, and you read the Constitution, you don't understand that they're talking about people who are held in slavery. So this country has a history to today of obfuscating the most difficult parts of their history around slavery, dressing it up, cleaning it up, and calling it something else. Someone like Dr. Medford and myself, we come along and we want to say to you, you know, it's almost, don't you ever hate it when your child comes and asks you a question you know you don't want to answer because it's just way too complicated? That's how I feel half the time. When you start to bring something up, you see your editor or whoever it is, and it's just like, you know, we don't want to deal with you, and we don't want to deal with that. And yet someone has to say it. But we don't, and when you've been trained by the historical profession, you actually have to work yourself out of that training to be able to say it. So that I'll leave it at that. There's much more I could say, but that's enough.
But before we move on, that whole issue of the Confederate battle flag and it being used as a symbol of Southern heritage, we need to remember that that heritage is based on slavery. It's based on the exploitation and the oppression of a group of people just because of the color of their skin. And so if you want to wave that flag over a state capitol, do it, but understand what you're doing. If you want to put it on your front lawn, do it, but don't say it's a part of heritage unless you're willing to admit what that heritage is all about.
Well, and I think that when we understand symbolic meaning, because again, I'm always thinking about this, so that okay, it's a flag, but the symbolic meaning that that flag evokes, both in terms of pride, in terms of loyalty to the Southern cause, when we think about how the Southern cause and how the Civil War, how all of this got reinterpreted in terms of what we have today, if you watch history, you can watch, it's almost like if you ever drive a stick shift car, you can watch the gears being shifted, which is what David White is talking about in terms of when this narrative changes around the Civil War, when we start to embrace our Confederate brothers. These were acts of sedition. The South rose up against this nation. And so we took acts of sedition, and by reinterpreting what happened, by forgiving our brothers, and in the process of forgiving our brothers, we had to expunge African Americans from the narrative. We have to understand that a choice was made. And the choice was that we're going to now come together, the blue and the gray, but the black is going to have to be left behind in order for this narrative to succeed. We're asking, we're saying, we're demanding, our scholarship is such that we need to reinsert the agency and the power that African Americans brought into this whole situation.
Thank you so much. So I think now we're going to open the floor to any questions to both doctors.
Don't ask any difficult ones.
Thank you. Excellent, wonderful panel. I've always been curious about the degree to which this. I've always been curious about the degree to which this city was part of the Underground Railroad. I know that by the census of 1840, the balance had tipped. There were more free blacks than slaves in the city by that time. So one would expect that there were probably a lot of people here, black people here, former slaves, who might have participated actively in that. On the other hand, D.C. itself was a destination, a final destination for many of the people coming north. I know that, as you say, there are numbers, but what is your sense of this? To what extent did the Underground Railroad run through Washington, D.C.?
You have to understand where D.C. sits. And so even though this is a place where slavery is enforced, Virginia is a slave state, Maryland is a slave state, but when you start to move up in through, this is a prime corridor, both for people coming in and for people leaving. And so you have senators, you have statesmen who are bringing their slaves with them, but you also have people who are coming out. You have black churches here, you have abolitionists here, you have people who are moving through. And so it's a very active. Stanley Harold, do you know his work? Yes, and so Stanley Harold really talks about what it looks like here in DC. It's more complicated than, if you have a northern state, it's very different. When you have southern states, we don't usually talk about the Underground Railroad in southern states in the same way, but DC is an exception. So we do have active scholarship around people escaping from slavery and the Underground Railroad in Washington, D.C., in ways in which we don't necessarily have it, let's say, in Mississippi or in places that are further south. So I would say that the numbers I can't give you, but we have multiple African American churches here. We have multiple narratives of escape here, Georgetown, and whenever, I didn't say this before, and this is something that I can't prove with historical documents per se, but whenever you see a black community, a thriving black community, you know that escape from slavery and an Underground Railroad component is going to attach itself to that community.
Just from my research on Maryland, I look at the southern part of Maryland, and if you go back and look at the runaway advertisements, many of them will say, we think they are in Georgetown.
Yes.
They know somebody here.
Yes.
So a lot of those from Maryland are running into Washington, D.C., and they find refuge from the free black community that's here. And you just have to look at those runaway advertisements in the local papers in southern Maryland to see that.
Yeah, and look at the church histories. Those church histories will say, we were part of the Underground Railroad. I want that bulletin. I'm always looking for that little church bulletin. That is like the document for me. Yeah.
You talked about the flag. I like the the flag to the ISIS flag, the Confederate flag. I see a lot of parallels there. They do not, especially Republicans, do not want to see. But can you talk about the buildings, statues, the entire communities that were named after, in honor of Confederacy,
Oh.
people? Can you touch on that?
I went to Richmond and went down Monument Avenue. And so how many of you been to Richmond and been down Monument Avenue? And so, you know, the statues look like they were just erected yesterday. I'm a conservator by training. So bronze, public art requires something not to turn green, and you know, those statues are highly polished. They are as bronze as the day they were put out. There's no bird poop anywhere. They are lovingly cared for. So that I was so disturbed the first time I went to Richmond, because what that said to me is that the precepts and the tenets of the Confederacy are being lovingly nurtured. When you fly, I'm just answering from this is not a scholar who's speaking now. This is Cheryl LaRoche speaking now. When I see that flag, when I see those statues, when I'm in Virginia and I'm on Jeb Stuart Avenue and Lee Highway, and when I am in all of these places, what it says to me is that we revere the people who fought this nation and who upheld slavery. And we revere them to this day, and we revere them deeply in our hearts and in our souls. And when you look at the opposite of it, not only are those statues huge, someone said, but when you look, if you study, there are ways in which when we want to portray, remember I talked about self-possession, when we want to portray nobility, when we want to, they are reared up on those horses, ramrod straight, just everything, every facet of the statues are conveying a message. And yet when you go to Lincoln Park and you see Lincoln with the, you know, the abject slave down on his knees, you know, the public art is a handmaiden to history. We don't often understand that. Why do we need to now elevate these former rebellious fighters of the South to that level? We don't, when you go around all of, you know, what is it my friend always says, a dead white man on a horse. So every square you go into in DC, right, is what you get. And when we think about having a statue of a woman, if we have one, believe me, she'll be 4'2" and she'll be down on the ground. She won't be up 50 feet on a pedestal and then rising up, standing, you know, like the Statue of Liberty. So that it's a very important question, because we don't often question the symbolism that we're being fed. And so that flag is feeding something that this nation has been carrying. And until it comes down, I would suggest that the nation will continue to feed the attitudes and some of the undercurrents around race and slavery that we still know exist today.
And it's something that's accepted by the North as well. I mean, we in the North made it okay for that to occur. It's almost like the northern half of the country feels it has to be apologetic for the war. You know, we have to forget what happened because we were somehow responsible. That makes absolutely no sense at all. It's,
Standing up.
How it pertains to what I've heard here today. That I despair will come off as a bit of name dropping, which is really not my intent. So
That's okay, drop a name.
I hope it's.
See if we know who it is.
But because of the work I did, I was involved in the Jimmy Carter re-election campaign, political advertising. And during that campaign, this was 1980, something that's not done anymore, but we did a series of 5-minute spots that included him in conversation with groups of citizens, seniors and workers at the construction site. And the last one we did was a group of public housing residents here in Adams Morgan area, and all African American. And of course, that campaign, you recall, during the Iranian hostage crisis, and he didn't really campaign much. A lot of it was done this way. And for most of those conversations that we produced, he was very animated when he was actually in conversation with the people, but he gave us a hard time about having to do it. The idea of doing it just interfered with his duties so much, except, as I said, when he got into the actual conversation. But this time he arrived and he was really energized. He really was looking forward to this because it was the day after Ronald Reagan made his speech in Mississippi in which he referred to states' rights. And he was so outraged. He truly thought these were the people that he wanted to have this conversation with. In talking to us before, which he did not enjoy doing in these previous rollouts, but in this one, he just went on and on about how does somebody talk about that and run for president. He thought it was traitorous.
Mm-hmm.
It was an immediate disqualifier in his mind.
It's a code. He's speaking in code. What do you mean?
That was his reference. Of course, he's a Southerner himself, and that's what he brought to this. But Reagan was not. But he clearly had. Carter didn't accept the idea that he didn't know what he was doing. It's just impossible not to know. Was his, no matter where he came from, no matter what his experience was. We particularly relished his enthusiasm and so forth, but we were saying, I'm not sure that's going to go over. We weren't going to stop him. Of course, these conversations went on for an hour, and we edited it down to 4.5 minutes. But so we weren't going to stop him. But we did want to disabuse him with the notion that this was going to go over in a big way, and he'd have a really successful conversation. And so we hinted at that. We didn't say that directly. Mm-hmm. But he was, oh, no. I know they are going to respond to it. And, of course, they didn't. They really had no idea. Just they had nothing to say to him. He was very distressed by that, too.
Oh, I can understand that, though. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
I have two questions. I'll start with the second one because that might be simpler. I wanted to ask Dr. LaRoche, and it's a matter of technique, what is the difference between what you would do and how you look at history and your lens as opposed to a historian? When I was little, I wanted to be an anthropologist, and at that time I thought it was, digging bones and studying bones. So I would like to know in technique, and we came in a little late, so I'm assuming that Dr. Medford, you're a historian?
Yes.
She's a paper historian.
Okay. So what would be the difference in how you, that's the first question. And then I'd like for you all to speak to the role of Harriet Tubman and what she did. She's one of the few heroes, and as I listen to you talk, I'm thinking there were probably other people that should have been celebrated.
Absolutely.
But I was just talking to my daughter today about Harriet Tubman, and I didn't think that she got, enough accolades for what she did and her bravery. So 2 questions.
Well, the first thing I would say is that when I'm reading a narrative around the Underground Railroad, I believe it. I don't throw it out. So I start by believing it, and then I will work to disprove it. Because if I start by not believing it and I throw it out, I don't do the work. So when I finally say, no, this is not the case, I have done a very thorough job of researching. What often happens, particularly around Black history, people will say, oh, that's not true, I don't believe it. And there's no rigor with that. They just get rid of it. No, it never happened. And so there's no research. So I go backwards. And so people are sometimes a little surprised that I'm researching something that seems to be pretty like, let's say John Brown kissing the baby on the steps before his execution. I read that in the newspaper, and so the 19th century newspapers, which historians don't like because newspapers lie in that time period, they just make up stuff.
But they do now too.
They do now too, but it's really blatant. They're trying to, yeah, they do now too. We even have our TV commentators, so I guess what was my point? So that's one thing. But I think the major difference, and I see this with my students and grad students that I work with, is that because we can't turn to the diaries, because we can't turn to some of the kinds of evidence that would be readily available to other scholars, we have to look in different places. And so one of the things I speak about in the book is how to use oral history effectively, so that much of our history is oral, and how do you triangulate that? I know, and I say this in the book, if I hear oral history that's 100% accurate, I know it's wrong. I'm expecting an internal tension. What happens with a historian is when they see something is wrong, the whole thing's gone. Oh,
Sure.
that, they found a discrepancy. It's an unreliable source. And once you have doubt is a very nasty thing. Once you have an unreliable source, the whole thing goes out. In an oral history, you got the wrong date, you're in the wrong county, you got the wrong year, sometimes you're in the wrong state, but what I know is that generally the incident happened. So when someone says we're part of the Underground Railroad, I might not have another shred of evidence except that, but I'm going to hang on to that, and I'm going to keep looking so that the evidence is not obvious. You actually do have to infer. Another thing that doesn't always work well with historians. So we're using newspapers that don't always work well. We're using sources that are generally unstable on multiple levels. Newspapers, oral histories, all kinds of church narratives that aren't written by historians. We're using documents that slave narratives were discredited for years. You take all of these discredited, unstable sources, bring them all together, layer them, and triangulate them, and when you start to see, I'm working with a story about John Brown. I have probably looked at 40 different narratives. None of them match. So I'm doing the same thing with a piece of history that's very famous. And I'm seeing one story here and one story here. And so now I think finally, after about 35 sources, I think I have the accurate narrative of what happened. So that's the first thing. And then archaeology, ground truthing in archaeology is another avenue. It's expensive and it can be unstable because once it's dug up, then interpretation happens. And I would say that African Americans are the most misinterpreted people on the planet. And so this happens in archaeology too. You dig it up and then you make up stories that don't actually relate to what happened, because archaeology is also an act of interpretation, even though it's a science. So, and I use that in a lot of mapping and geography.
We are a little bit more liberal and more sophisticated in our use of sources now.
Yes, I know.
We start with the premise that all sources are problematic, whether they're oral sources or written sources, because everybody has an agenda, or a motivation for how documents are generated. Actually, I use newspapers a lot because they have wonderful, wonderful things in there. But I always so double check to see if I can find that source somewhere else, that information somewhere else as well. But newspapers are terrific.
Yes.
I use oral sources. I use the slave narratives, and everyone says you shouldn't because people are writing this stuff when they're 80 and 90 years old and they knew slavery as a child or something like that.
Yeah.
But I think, though, that these people who may have been very young when they were enslaved are still being raised by people who were adults when slavery existed, and they're hearing these stories. And these stories really do matter. Excuse me. So I use them. I also know, though, that they're not always going to be accurate. Now, in terms of Harriet Tubman, I agree, the woman was phenomenal. During the war, she's leading a group of soldiers up the Combahee River in South Carolina, and she's helping to liberate about 700 people. She does get a pension, I believe, in the end, but I think it's a pension that she gets because of her husband,
Right.
not because of the work that she was
Right.
doing. But and she's serving as a spy and as a nurse and so many different things during the war. But there are all of these other women who are doing things during the war as well. So I think sometimes we pull out Harriet Tubman and as if she and Sojourner Truth are the only black women in the 19th century who are doing anything. And there are all of these women who are unnamed, who are doing things. You have people like Mary Elizabeth Bowser, who's in the Confederate White House in Richmond, who's actually there as a servant, but who's really spying. And she's then distributing the information that she hears from Jefferson Davis and his cabinet when they're having dinner. She's getting that information from her former owner, Elizabeth Van Lew, whom everyone thinks is crazy, but she's not all that crazy. She's getting the information to the Union generals. And so she's in that strategic position, very dangerous position, but most people don't know who she is. They've just never heard of her. And she's doing some of the same kinds of things that Harriet Tubman was attempting to do. And all of these women who are being left behind on the plantations when their husbands join the Union Army, and they're having to deal with owners who know that their husbands are now in the Union Army and who's now abusing these wives and the children. All of these women who's serving as nurses who are going south, northern women like, what's her name, Charlotte Fortin, who's going south to the Sea Islands, to Port Royal, and teaching the contraband and the soldiers how to read and write for the first time. These are women of privilege in the North who are going south to do this, who are sacrificing themselves and jeopardizing their lives to do this. So I think we definitely need to talk more about what women are doing. Women are on board ships. Black women are on board ships like the Red Rover, serving as nurses. You never hear about that. You hear about the 180,000 plus black men who are serving. But what about these women who are there on board these ships who are serving?
I've been researching women who escaped from slavery. And so I understand on a much broader level that why their stories are so hard to get to and why it's so difficult to really talk about them. And it's the nature of the sources. They're often not written about in the same way. But Harriet Tubman, I want to make a point. It's kind of like talking about Lincoln as a great emancipator. You have to remember, I never call people in this time period illiterate because it implies that they're ignorant. And people will often say, well, they're illiterate, but they still manage, as if illiteracy is implying their intellectual prowess. You have to remember that there are anti-literacy laws. People are not allowed to read and write. And in Maryland, there are no laws, but it's by convention. You will be beaten if you are found to have these books. So you have a woman who can neither read nor write. She is eluding some of the wealthiest people on the Eastern Shore. She is managing to bring people out of slavery, not one at a time, but groups at a time. She manages to get herself where she needs to be, when she needs to be there, without the advantage of literacy. She's on the train when the train needs to come. She gets where she needs to go. She is able then to move around in this country without one of the major aids that we all use. She is a phenomenal woman. And while I agree that she has to represent the hundreds, if not thousands, of other women that we'll never talk about, she is a conductor. She is a black woman, and yet we theorize that women don't generally escape from slavery, and yet she is the symbol, the emblem. But one of the reasons why she keeps coming back is that we cannot imagine the amount of fortitude it takes to make a decision to leave your home, to leave your family, to go into the unknown, to not know whether you're going to be able to eat, whether you're going to have shelter, whether you're going to ever live through this experience, and then to come back time and again to rescue largely friends and family. Because one of the things that we don't get from the narrative that we've been handed is the amount of connectedness people are feeling towards their families. the amount of sacrifice people are really putting in to help their families out. Tubman is clearly one of them, and when she brings her aged mother and father out of slavery, she rigs up this thing, this contraption. Again, the level of intellect that people have to display, and we have to determine that by means other than literacy. Here's
And
a
the fact that as slaves, you were given food, it was very minimal, but taking them through the woods and, all these places, you had to figure out some survival skills.
And the last thing I'll say, not just about Tubman, but in general. When I lecture, I largely talk about the fact that we never assign the noble qualities to people held in slavery. Tubman is a great leader. We don't use the lofty words that we're going to use with Jeb Stuart and Jefferson Davis and all the people on the horse. We don't use those words with people like Tubman. But here's a woman of nobility, of respect, of great personal integrity. She has all of these qualities of leadership because she has to instill confidence in these people. She has a gun, of course, that's helping her. But she has to instill confidence in you to even want to leave with her in the first place. She's a remarkable woman. And if I think about, you want to ask her, how exactly did you get this done? Because we still don't understand. We still do not understand the details of what Tubman was doing, even though there are several books written. The Underground Railroad is still a great mystery, and what Tubman succeeded in doing, particularly when she's in Baltimore and other places, we don't know.
Well, I think that's a wonderful way to end. Daughter of Maryland, Harriet Tubman. Please help me thank Drs. LaRoche and Medford.